Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction horror TV series named Shining Girls. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins in 1964 when the little Kirby was admiring the amusement park she designed at her doorstep. Then a mysterious man claiming to have injured his knee sat down to rest. After some conversation, the man, having seen Kirby's design for a Ferris wheel and cable car, noticed an upside-down cup. It's her makeshift zoo. He listened to the cup, then released the bee trapped underneath. Capturing the bee, he spoke in riddles that startled the girl. After pulling the bee's wings off, he pulled a pony toy from his pocket and handed it to Kirby, hoping she would safeguard it for him. He implied that while the pony might not be popular, it was easier to tame than the bee. Despite Kirby's reluctance, the man insisted she keep it, saying she will accept it as she always does. She took it home, oblivious to the man's sly smile. Fast forward 28 years to April 13, 1992, Kirby has grown up and moved to Chicago with her mother. An attack 6 years prior had left her with unreliable memory, prompting her to habitually record everything in detail, from the location of her desk at work to the leaking water pipe above, her Godzilla mug, and even the name of her cat, Grendel. After jotting everything down, she tucked the notebook under her mattress. Kirby worked at the Sun-Times newspaper office as a clerical worker, arranging her desk meticulously and adjusting the Godzilla mug beneath the leak of the water pipe before starting her day. She much preferred losing herself in the world of music than dealing with people. On the street outside, water from the underground pipes erupted on a grand scale. A large number of police officers were involved in the investigation. The reporter for the Sun-Times, Dan, was skeptical that such an incident would attract so much police attention. Venturing into the underground pipes to seek the truth, he was quickly issued an expulsion order by the police. Handing his business card to the officers, Dan overheard someone cautioning to watch her leg as they prepared to move her out. It seems like the police had discovered a woman's body in the pipes. After lunch, Kirby returned to find her workspace claimed by a colleague and her water cup replaced by one with a bull design. The colleague insisted it had always been his desk, directing Kirby to another location. Looking up at the leaking pipe above, Kirby confirmed it was indeed her desk, but she didn't contest it. Checking where her colleague pointed, she found her belongings intact, except the Godzilla mug was not catching water, but rather repurposed as a pen holder. Puzzled, she wondered if her memory was failing her again. The police soon summoned Kirby because the body found underground, identified as Julia, bore many similarities to an assault she suffered 6 years ago. They needed her to confirm the suspect from a photo album. Meanwhile, reporter Dan also discovered that Julia had disappeared 2 years prior and intended to report on it. Consequently, his superior assigned him to investigate. Kirby revealed that the 6-year-old assault case had left her with a psychological scar, leading her to change to her current name and identity. The police had narrowed down a few suspects they wanted Kirby to identify. However, she could not recognize the assailant's face, so she was unable to make an identification and left after closing the album. The only thing Kirby remembered was the voice of the assailant cursing at her. Returning home, she went to her apartment, 2B, and went straight to bed. Awakened by the sound of a man breaking in and urgent knocking, she found a dog entering named Grendel on its collar. Now, mysteriously, it had become a dog. She retrieved her notebook from under the mattress, crossing out where it said cat and adding "is my dog" after Grendel. The scene shifts to a girl, Ginny, who arrives with her red umbrella at the Adler Planetarium. Settling at her workstation, she finds a dead bee with its wings torn off. A colleague comments that bees are messengers from heaven, a belief stemming from ancient Egypt. Without giving it much thought, Ginny tosses the bee into the trash, unaware that this act would mark her first encounter with death. Later that evening, she heads to the rooftop to have a smoke, but with a sudden bang, the door shuts behind her. Thinking it's just the wind, she doesn't worry, until she realizes she's left her access card behind and can't get back inside. Out of the blue, it starts to rain, even though there had been no sign of rain just moments before. She notices her red umbrella conveniently placed on the parapet wall. It's a curious detail. If someone intentionally left the umbrella there, how could they have known Ginny would go to the rooftop and that it would rain? Meanwhile, Dan meets with the police officer who had previously dismissed him in a bar to inquire about the progress of a case. The officer reveals that the victim, Julia, a social worker who disappeared 2 years ago, was serving a patient named Pavel, who was suspected of involvement in Julia's disappearance due to his mental issues. Without a lawyer present, the police couldn't officially charge him, and since Julia's body was never found, the case remains open. Their conversation also reveals Dan's troubled past, including domestic abuse and drug possession. The police hope Dan will portray Pavel as the suspect in his reporting, which could help close the case. Dan, however, refuses, suggesting the story needs further development, resulting in a tense parting. At the newspaper office, Kirby is helping a colleague retrieve some briefings from 2 years ago about Julia's disappearance. As she's engrossed in the documents, a photographer named Marcus approaches, asking Kirby to pull some files. Complimenting Marcus's photography skills at the city hall, Kirby is left blushing after Marcus takes a candid shot of her. The chief editor, seeing the briefing in Kirby's hands and mistaking it for Dan's work, is corrected by Kirby. This infuriates Dan, sensing a rival for the story he's been working on. Kirby seizes the moment when Dan steps away to secretly review his notes, which include a detailed sketch of the autopsy of Julia and the address of the suspect Pavel. After work, Kirby followed the address to Pavel's place. Being the prime suspect, Pavel meant that reporters had practically emptied his family's supply of tea. Pavel's mother was irate at the sight of another visitor and couldn't be bothered to brew another pot of tea. She pointed to where her son was and sent Kirby on her way. Kirby, with a folding knife at the ready, nervously entered Pavel's dark room. It was pitch black until Pavel emerged from the shadows. In the room, a TV flickered with a blue screen, buzzing with static. Pavel denied killing Julia. He said the broken TV was kept on for the noise, which somehow helped his daughter sleep. Kirby wasn't in the mood to comment. She noticed that Pavel's voice was nothing like the assailants from years ago. Kirby left in a hurry but bumped into Dan, who had just arrived. In the restaurant, the two had an honest chat. Kirby revealed plans to quit her job soon and move to Orlando, seeking a change of pace. Dan found it odd and asked why she was interested in Pavel and so invested in Julia's case. Sensing an opportunity with the wealth of information Dan had, Kirby disclosed her own brush with an attacker 6 years earlier. Understanding Kirby's desire for change, or rather her need to escape, Dan pointed out that Orlando was the only city in Florida without a beach. Kirby just laughed it off, confident that she could identify the real killer's voice, meaning Pavel was not the man. To confirm if the killer was the same person, Dan introduced Kirby to his coroner friend. If the wounds on Kirby were caused by the same weapon as those on Julia, the likelihood of a serial killer would be much higher. During the verification process, Kirby and the lady coroner went back and forth, piecing together parts of the incident. The weapon was a knife with a likely wooden handle, as she had found wood splinters under her fingernails. Later on, Kirby lay on the morgue table to have her wounds examined. The cuts were crisscrossed and matched those on Julia exactly. The wounds were not continuous. There were breaks where passers-by had interrupted the attack. Kirby couldn't call for help since her mouth had been gagged. She clearly remembered walking her dog before the incident, but after that, her memory was hazy. It was the doctors who informed her that part of her intestines had been removed by the assailant. Kirby said that her lack of memory and the details of her injuries were things she only knew because the doctors told her afterward. She inquired whether anything had been left inside her body and whether Julia had had anything left in hers. Suddenly, Kirby snapped back to reality and realized that the lady coroner had turned into an old man. She became tense and called out loudly, asking where the lady coroner went. Dan looked confused and asked who the lady coroner was. He said the only coroner present was an old man, who he had introduced to Kirby from the start. Kirby, feeling as if her soul had left her body, turned and walked out, leaving Dan and the old man exchanging bewildered glances. Back at her home, and it's worth noting that her pet was still a dog, Kirby had a heart-to-heart with her mother. She explained that her desire to move was driven by the need to leave this place, as everything had changed for her since the attack. She felt like she could barely recognize the world anymore. Her mother suggested that moving to the other side of the United States wouldn't bring about the change she needed, and advised her to resolve her issues here instead. On the morning of April 15th, Kirby stopped Dan from publishing a report that would have pinned the blame on Pavel as the murderer. She believed the real killer must have left something on Julia. After consideration, Dan requested a delay in reporting from his editor, claiming there was a serial killer at large. The editor questioned the source of the serial killer theory, asking who had told him and if the information was reliable. However, Dan did not reveal Kirby and said it was just from an informant. After the planetarium show had ended, one individual lingered and struck up a conversation with Ginny. This person was the same one who had found Kirby back in 1964 and was the serial killer involved in the case. Posing as an astronomy enthusiast, the man attempted to get close to Ginny. When leaving, he even called out Ginny's name, which caught her off guard. The killer hastily asked if she still remembered him. Ginny searched her memory but couldn't place him in any of her groups. The killer muttered that, "It seems not today," and brushed off the interaction. It's been 28 years, but the killer's appearance has barely changed. Later one night, the killer followed Ginny to the astronomical tower. Seizing the moment when there were no onlookers, he swiftly killed her. Meanwhile, Kirby returned home and couldn't open her door. She knocked furiously, hoping her mother would open it for her. Instead, an old man answered, and the interior was not as she remembered her home. He calmly suggested she had the wrong place, saying, "This is 2B. Confused, Kirby checked her ID in a panic, which showed her apartment address had mysteriously changed from 2B to 3B. Despite her confusion, she proceeded upstairs, and to her surprise, her key worked. Inside, the apartment was completely transformed, and her pet Grendel was once again a cat. Then, the photographer Marcus emerged and embraced her tightly as if they were lovers. Overwhelmed by the revelations, Kirby could only mutter to herself that she had made it home. To recap the timeline we have so far, based on the killer's unchanged appearance and attire, we can deduce that he can travel through time. In 1986, Kirby was attacked by the killer but survived, later changing her name. But the killer might not know that Kirby had survived. Kirby's residence has inexplicably changed from 2B to 3B, and her colleague Marcus is now shockingly her husband. Caught off guard, Marcus asks Kirby if she went grocery shopping. They had prepared a long shopping list, yet Kirby returned empty-handed. Through Marcus, Kirby learns that she has a strained relationship with her mother, which is why her mother wasn't invited to Marcus's birthday party that evening. Seeing that Kirby hadn't gone to the store, Marcus decides to order takeout. At this point, colleagues, who were previously strangers, arrive and start chatting warmly with Kirby, leaving her as stunned as if she had seen ghosts. The sight of a wedding photo on the wall confounds her even more, but with all her colleagues there, she couldn't really say anything. With everyone's encouragement, Kirby reluctantly wishes her husband a happy birthday before rushing back to her room. Marcus is concerned, wondering what's going on. Kirby finds her notebook, where the content previously describing living with her mother now mentions living with Marcus. On the other side, Dan's investigation continues. On the morning of April 16th, he meets with the old coroner to review Julia's autopsy report. Back at the morgue, the old coroner presents the report and explains that Julia's father didn't dare to identify the body. A relative did. The investigations showed that Julia wasn't killed in the underground pipes, but was dumped there after being tortured to near death. Remarkably, her body was intact with no parts missing or extra items. Strangely, according to Kirby, the killer should have stuffed something inside Julia. Dan discovers a piece of radium ore among the debris at the scene, a product of a chemical company, which hasn't been sold for 42 years. The old coroner feels this doesn't prove much, only that the stone has been there longer than Julia. Dan takes photos to keep as records and then asks to see the body. The old coroner agrees, provided Dan can handle it. Upon examining, Dan seems to find something. After turning off the lights, he carefully inspects and finds traces of radium that had once been inside her. Meanwhile, the killer returns home and leisurely begins reading the newspaper. Take note that he was previously using a brown coffee cup, but when he picks it up again, it is changed into a white ceramic cup. The killer gives it an extra glance but doesn't dwell on the change. The reason for this alteration seems to be because he spots the article written by Dan about the Julia murder case. Reading the newspaper, this event influences the killer's subsequent actions, ultimately leading to a shift in time and space, a phenomenon that even the killer might not be aware of. The scene shifts back to the year 1990. The killer is conversing with a patient, discussing the war, indicating they likely share a bond as war comrades. His comrade asks if he is here to see Julia and if she is his girlfriend. The killer replies, "No, not at this time." After descending the stairs, he attempts to strike up a conversation with Julia, but comes off too much like harassment and is promptly rejected. When Julia goes upstairs, someone remarks that she's half an hour early. This detail is intriguing. If she's early, how did the killer manage to time their encounter so precisely? So it's possible that the killer has traversed to this time point after observing many times before, making this the first time he has actively appeared. That evening, Julia returns home to find her father packing luggage. They must have just moved in recently. Among the pile of luggage, Julia discovers a selfie of herself at the beach, which is strange because she doesn't recall ever being at the beach. However, her father remembers and even mentions that Julia wasn't very happy that day. It seems that the changes in space and time have also affected Julia. Sitting on her bed, the noise outside attracts her attention. She goes to investigate and finds the beach selfie, which someone has placed on a chair. Then she hears a noise downstairs and goes to check, only to discover a photo on the carpet. When she picks it up, she's shocked. It's a picture of her holding the photo right at that moment. Her instincts tell her a creep has entered the house, so she rushes to the kitchen and grabs a knife. At that moment, she finds another photo on the faucet, a photo depicting her current stance. It's outrageous. Suddenly, the phone rings. The killer's voice tells her not to be nervous and he's not in the house. Julia asks how he got in, to which the killer responds she let him in and she will get to know him in the future. He says those photos are from the future, but she might not live to see it. Completely bewildered and panicking, Julia drops the phone receiver. Back to the present, although Kirby still doesn't quite understand what's happening. Fortunately, at least the main task of collaborating with Dan to search for the killer hasn't changed. Dan tells her that to ensure the authenticity of the report, she can't act both as a colleague and a source. For the sake of the truth, Dan must treat Kirby as the protagonist of the event and needs to interview her. Kirby decides to give him more information. Kirby takes Dan to a laundry shop. It's revealed that after the killer attacked her, he left a matchbox from the Happy Bee bar inside her body, and the address led to this laundry shop. Dan looks around and remarks that the location would actually be quite fitting for a bar, but Kirby has checked the records and there has never been a bar here. Dan pulls out the photo of the radium ore and asks Kirby to talk more about what happened at the time of the incident. Kirby tries hard to recall that she was walking her dog alone by the lakeside the night she was attacked. Dan asked, since she and Marcus were married, where he was at the time and what about her other family members. These questions catch Kirby off guard. She doesn't want to answer because she doesn't even know how to. Dan notices this and asks if Kirby has any family. Kirby replies she has told him about her mother, but Dan denies it, saying that they had never talked about her mom. Kirby shakes her head, realizing she can't explain herself clearly anymore, and Dan decides to wait for a day when she's calmer to continue the interview. Later, Kirby arrives at a church to find her mother, who is leading the congregation in singing praises to the Lord. Upon seeing her daughter, she excitedly embraces her as if they haven't seen each other for a long time. Kirby hopes to get her hospital records and photos from 6 years prior. Following her mother home, Kirby starts searching for the old hospital records while her mother finds a videotape. It contains a recording of Kirby performing on stage with her. Kirby asks about the reason for their estrangement. Her mother replies that it was Kirby's decision, but she also says Kirby is always welcome to come to church and be a part of the activities. On the other side, Dan found the nursing home where Julia used to work and learned from an elderly resident that someone had apparently followed her before she disappeared. This elderly man is likely the same one who spoke in 1990, mentioning how Julia had arrived half an hour early. At the time, Julia believed that legal proceedings would resolve her issues. The elderly man then praised Julia, calling her a shining girl, a term that appears for the first time. Dan rushed to the police to confirm the details of Julia being followed. However, the police didn't pay much attention to these details. When it came to Kirby, they showed even less patience. The police brought out Kirby's file and revealed that her original name was Sharon. They mentioned that a few months after the attack she had suffered years ago, she had a complete breakdown and couldn't remember anything. Thus, her accounts were deemed unreliable. The officer suggested to Dan that he should verify if there's anything amiss with Kirby before returning with further questions. After a night's rest, Dan confronted Kirby about her name change, asking why she hadn't told him and about her previous job postings on a forum. Kirby produced the report and photos of her injuries from that time, which could only be described as horrific. However, the police report had downplayed the incident, which is no wonder she changed her name, trying to forget the memories. Oddly enough, it wasn't just that. After taking her statement back then, the police had promised to return, but never did. Strangely, on the day she was attacked, there were many people around, yet not a single witness came forward, and there was no record of any witnesses in the police report. After the attack, it seemed as if everyone around had suddenly disappeared. Kirby always had a strange feeling before the incident, as if someone was constantly entering and leaving her house. Dan shared with her that Julia had been followed, and if it was the same killer, he was likely casing the area and could have also followed Kirby. Kirby asked Dan to keep it secret and not let anyone from the newspaper know she was his informant. After Dan agreed, they went together to Julia's house to investigate. Dan's car was a mess, and Kirby found a game disc. Dan then mentioned he had a 12-year-old son. When he asked about Kirby's plans for children, she didn't know how to respond and evaded the question, saying she and Marcus had no plans for kids. Kirby then turned the tables and asked Dan what he thought of Marcus. Dan was perplexed by the question. He complimented Marcus, saying he was a good person. Upon arriving at Julia's house, they found the place swarming with reporters. Julia's father shut the door, adamantly refusing to give any interviews. Dan had to resort to a more indirect approach, so they split up to carry out their plan. Kirby lied, claiming to be a friend of Julia's, and managed to slip into the house. She stealthily went upstairs and began riffling through Julia's belongings, where she found the recording of the call Julia had made to the police. Kirby located a player and played the tape. Initially, it was the call to the police, but it was followed by a call from the killer, which Julia had inadvertently recorded. The killer could be heard telling Julia that the police would arrive in 18 minutes, and by the time they did, he'd be right beside her, claiming he'd always been by their side, experiencing everything with them. Kirby recognized the voice as the same person who had attacked her years ago and took the tape. Meanwhile, Dan downstairs encountered the killer at the scene. Unaware that he was face-to-face with the perpetrator, Dan was told by the man that he was a reporter for the Daily News. Dan knew the Daily News had ceased publication 10 years ago and called him out on his lie. They had a disjointed conversation, and when the killer learned that Dan suspected someone else, he became increasingly cautious. After returning, Kirby played the tape for the editor. However, since she had taken the tape without the family's consent, the evidence could not be officially used. Nonetheless, the editor decided to give the police a heads up, especially since the killer had used the word "you" in the plural, indicating there was more than one victim. Kirby surmised that Julia had hidden the tape because the killer was close by and she didn't have time to do anything else. Meanwhile, the killer had returned home, leisurely lay down in bed, and went to sleep. The scene shifts to the morning of April 20th, when Dan awoke from a hangover to find himself strangely injured and bleeding, with a receipt from a bar in his pocket and shards of glass embedded in the wound. He went back to the bar to retrieve his car keys and noticed a few keys were missing from his keychain, though the janitor assured him that was all that was found. Once in the car, he discovered a music cassette playing that wasn't his, and initially thought it was a prank by his son. Back home, he found his son playing video games and hurried him off to school, casually asking about the tape in the car. The son flatly denied it, and Dan didn't dwell on it. He noticed some books had been knocked over on the bookshelf, which he attributed to his son, and straightened them up, oblivious to the killer watching him from outside the door. Let's rewind to 2 days prior. Kirby had spent the entire night sifting through 136 unsolved female homicide cases from the past 25 years in the local area, but they were just summaries, useless without the detailed police reports. The tape clue was also inadmissible since it was stolen by Kirby, whom the police considered an unreliable informant. They had to find another way. After work, Dan and Kirby went to the police archives under the pretext of writing a biography of the police department, easily dismissing the on-duty officer. They began to look into each of the female victims Kirby had identified. Meanwhile, at a convenience store, the killer was reading the newspaper when a girl approached him for help. Since she didn't have her ID, the store owner refused to sell her alcohol, and she hoped the killer would buy it for her. The killer coolly suggested she take her chance when the owner dropped his coins. As if on cue, the store owner dropped his coins and bent over to pick them up. The girl seized the opportunity to slip into the storeroom, followed by the killer. She asked him curiously how he knew about the coins, to which he replied that he always kept an eye on the store and knew its habits well, although it was the first time he had noticed her. The girl grew uneasy as the killer intentionally pointed her to the wrong exit. When she realized there was no door, the killer cornered her and said menacingly that they wouldn't have gotten here so soon. It's all her fault. The real mistake is that she took the path he laid out for her. Just when the girl thought she was dealing with a madman and feared for her life, the killer turned and walked away. After hours of searching, Kirby discovered a female corpse with the same incision named Willie, who had gold tacks inside her body and died 8 years ago back in 1984. The pair then found several more victims, each with various odd items inserted into their bodies. As they neared the truth, Dan started to buckle under the pressure and excused himself to contact his son. He went upstairs to smoke with some cop friends, unaware that the killer had already found Dan's son. The killer, posing as Dan's colleague, tried to extract information about Dan's progress, but the boy was clueless since his father never discussed cases with him. After giving the boy some chocolate, the killer calmly left. When Dan returned, he found Kirby standing next to the evidence box from her case. She told him that she had read all the files. In 20 years, the killer had struck 8 times, taking the lives of 7 women, with her as the sole survivor. Dan wanted to go home to make dinner for his son, but Kirby was adamant about continuing her research and even planned to take the files to Dan's house. Holding a matchbox from Happy Bee Bar, Kirby insisted it was left inside her by the killer and that she had to investigate thoroughly. Unable to dissuade her, Dan agreed to let her come home with him, but insisted she put the matchbox back, as it might be needed when the law finally caught up with the killer. After hesitating, she complied. The moment they got home, Dan's son quickly turned off the TV and pretended to do homework. But the warmth of the TV betrayed him, and Dan easily saw through the act. The boy mentioned that one of Dan's colleagues had come looking for him, but he couldn't remember any distinctive features. Unaware it was the killer, Dan didn't make much of it, but reminded his son to take notes when meeting strangers. Dan asked Kirby if she wanted to call Marcus, as the investigation's end time was uncertain. Kirby didn't take it seriously, claiming they lacked a strong connection. Seeing a photo of Dan's ex-wife, she learned that not only was she an addict, but she also had other issues, which led to their separation. Dan insisted that Kirby call Marcus, so she reluctantly reported her safety. While continuing to sift through the files, Dan discovered Kirby's notebook filled with many details of his life, making him think her mind wasn't clear, potentially jeopardizing the investigation. Kirby's reason for her detailed notes was that she was constantly haunted by her past experiences, giving her a reason never to forget. The 2 investigators discovered that the bodies of the 8 victims each contained different items such as prayer cards, buttons, radium ore, matchboxes, and so on. The problem is that all this information was obtained through unofficial procedures and must be cross-checked with the families of the victims or eyewitnesses, otherwise it cannot be used as evidence. However, Dan plans to communicate with the chief editor tomorrow morning. Another issue is that the item inside the body of the victim from 1972, Summer, is indistinguishable due to the poor quality of the old photos. When Kirby woke up, she found the TV on. Dan had already gone to work, and only his son was preparing breakfast. She wanted to clear away the gruesome photos next to the breakfast table, but the boy was already accustomed to them. Nevertheless, Kirby still moved the photos to the top of the fridge. Later, Dan handed over the investigation materials to the chief editor, who realized that the police had locked on to the wrong suspect and planned to give the police a heads up. Dan seized the opportunity to suggest a collaboration with the police to access more detailed information. The chief editor decided to feature the case in this Sunday's special and start it with Dan's informant. After much hesitation, Dan broke his promise and revealed that his informant was actually Kirby, also a victim of this case. The editor was furious, stating that such a report lacks credibility and no one would take it seriously. Dan struggled to soften the editor's stance, emphasizing that many of the findings were Kirby's, who is a victim herself. Meanwhile, Kirby found Marcus and requested the negatives from the 1972 Summer case. She wanted to see exactly what the killer had placed inside Summer's body. It was only then that Marcus realized she was collaborating with Dan on the case. Due to Dan's poor history, he feared Dan might be using Kirby, which could bring her more harm. But with Kirby's firm stance, Marcus had no choice but to dig up the old case files. Many photos where Summer was too far to be seen clearly were found, but finally, a close-up photo was located. Kirby asked Marcus to print it out for her. At the same time, the killer infiltrated Dan's home, glancing around before selecting a few books from the bookcase and knocking them down. The fact that Dan awoke on the 20th to find the books had fallen turns out to be the work of the killer, but now it's not yet the 20th. When the killer opened the fridge door, Kirby's investigation files tumbled down from above. The killer realized he might be exposed. Dan sought out Kirby, first apologizing for revealing her identity, then telling her that if they hoped for success in this matter, Kirby must step forward to speak out for the victims. However, Kirby was not optimistic, thinking that coming forward would embarrass the police force. And given her mental state, the credibility of her reporting could be significantly reduced. Dan attempted to reason with her, arguing that the perspective could be shifted to focus on the other 7 victims. But bluntly put, the stories of the deceased don't have the same longevity as reports featuring the living. Kirby, however, remained non-committal, and the two parted ways on bad terms. Back at her desk, Marcus had finished developing the photos. This time, Kirby clearly saw that inside Summer was a string of keys from the Adler Planetarium. She rushed to the planetarium and learned from the duty officer that these were keys for the staff lockers. After some investigation, she discovered that the owner of the keys was still alive, none other than Ginny, who had not yet become a victim. It meant that Ginny's time of suffering had not yet arrived. At the moment, Ginny was giving a presentation, and Kirby sat in the audience patiently waiting. On the other hand, the unhappy departure with Kirby had already depressed Dan, and to add insult to injury, Marcus chose this moment to confront him. He reproached Dan for engaging in aimless activities. Marcus hoped Dan wouldn't influence Kirby. Dan agreed, and then headed to a bar to vent his frustrations. He gradually lost himself in the neon lit, all while the killer watched him from a distance. Meanwhile, Kirby found Ginny and confirmed the situation with the key. Ginny glanced at the photo and recognized it's her key. She lost it last week and spent $15 to get a new one made. However, the photo was from a 1972 crime scene, but the lockers were installed this year, and before Ginny, no one else should have used them. Ginny told Kirby to just throw the old key away since she now had a new key. She revealed that she had never heard of Summer, and when Kirby mentioned Julia, Willie, and others, Ginny didn't recognize any of them. Suddenly, Kirby seemed to realize something. After looking in the mirror at the entrance, her short hair had unexpectedly grown long. Due to her interaction with Ginny, time had shifted again. Excitedly, she told Ginny that her key couldn't have been lost last week because the photo was taken in 1972. Ginny found this person before her very strange and hurriedly left. After the bar closed, Dan staggered home, the killer trailing him to the subway station and striking up a conversation. Dan was blind drunk, yet he recognized the killer as the person he had chatted with that day. Despite sensing ill intent, he was helpless, the alcohol's effect and the killer's convincing act clouding his judgment. In a blur, he revealed some information, including the fact that there were still survivors. The killer was shaken to the core, contemplating extracting more information when the train arrived. He nearly pushed Dan onto the tracks but held back, watching as Dan boarded. On the empty train, Dan found a spot and fell into a deep sleep, waking up at the starting point of the 20th, forming a time loop. We know that after Dan woke up, time and space had changed, likely due to the killer learning about the survivors. With this episode's conclusion, let's sort out the timeline. 8 women have been attacked so far, including Kirby but not Ginny, who is still alive before the 20th. In 1972, Summer died, a planetarium key inside her. In 1980, Kirby was attacked, a bar matchbox inside her. In 1984, the victim Willie died, the item inside her unknown. In 1996, Julia died, radium ore inside her. By far, the connection between these items remains unknown. An attack 6 years ago nearly cost Kirby's life. She luckily survived, but lost her memory. The killer's recent spree, along with a series of other events, prompted her to seek the truth and prevent her death. During the investigation with Dan, they gradually got closer to the truth, but the killer closed in on them, learning from a drunken Dan that there were survivors among his victims. Upon learning there are survivors, the killer rushed through the years 1972, 1974, 1984, and 1986 to confirm whether the girls were truly dead. 1986 was the year Kirby was attacked. The killer didn't find a body but saw an ambulance. At the hospital, he learned Kirby was seriously injured but alive, so he decided to finish the job in the ICU, only to be stopped by a nurse. Unable to force his way, the killer concocted another plan. He cozied up to Kirby's mother, who was visibly agitated. After a brief exchange with the killer, she returned to arguing with the doctors who wouldn't let her into the ICU. Seizing the moment when the mother was distracted, the killer barged into the ward, only to be ejected by another nurse on duty. He had no choice but to retreat. Back to the present timeline, Kirby heads to work in the morning, as Dan reports the current progress of the investigation to the chief editor and colleagues. However, his colleagues present 2 challenges. First, the 7 cases are too far apart geographically, and there's no direct evidence to prove they were perpetrated by the same individual. Despite Dan's claims that an informant recognized the killer's voice from the victim's recordings, it's not particularly useful, as the informant is unwilling to reveal her identity and thus cannot be included in the report. The chief editor, while supportive of Dan, can only ask the colleagues to complete their current reports before returning to assist. Frustrated, Dan heads to the break room alone to tend to his wounds. Kirby walks in and Dan pulls down his sleeve to cover the injury. Kirby hands him a photo of a distinctive item left inside Summer from the 1972 murder, a storage locker key belonging to a Ginny, an employee at this year's Adler Planetarium. Dan thought such an outlandish clue was not possible and didn't take it seriously. He instead reproached Kirby for wasting time, suggesting that they'd be better off retrieving the audio tapes from Julia's murder case. Marcus knows Kirby is facing difficulties and offers to go with her. On the way, Kirby confirms that Marcus did not mix up the photo. Marcus then takes out a camera to cheer her up, even though he is completely unaware his wife sees him as a stranger. Kirby is also happy, engaging in selfies with Marcus. As Dan continues to follow up on leads, a colleague inadvertently gives some of the victims' names to a retired detective from one of the cases. Now Dan's visit to the archives has been exposed, and the local forum has decided to report these cases first. Dan acts decisively, deciding to publish the news tonight, writing a brief 2 sentences for each victim and hinting that more explosive information will be released in succession. On the other hand, after Kirby and Marcus find an audio analyst, Kirby asks to listen to the recordings, to which they are told it costs by the hour. Marcus suggests putting it on Dan's tab. The recording surprisingly has 2 tracks, even though the words spoken are identical. On closer inspection, the differences are quite clear. Both sets of words come from Julia's mouth. One sounds as if it has been filtered, and the other is a real-time phone recording. This means that before Julia even spoke these words, the killer played a recording of the original words. They wondered how it could be possible that the killer had known what Julia was going to say. Meanwhile, the killer sneaked into room 2B but came up empty-handed. The elderly resident who had lived there for 4 years claimed he had never heard of anyone named Kirby. The killer left without achieving his goal, but not before threatening the old man. On their way back, Marcus reminded Kirby that she had received several harassing phone calls before she was attacked. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Kirby felt uncomfortable and didn't understand why Marcus was digging so deep into the matter. Marcus simply replied, because he's her husband, and he should be the first person she turns to when she's in trouble. Later, they arrived at their former home, which was quite spacious. Kirby mentioned that it was just a temporary residence because her mother had to perform late at night, 3 times a week, and they had to stay there out of necessity. By the makeup mirror, Kirby seemed to have found something. She remembered a strange phrase that had been written on the wall in the past: Sharon gone like the smoke. Sharon was Kirby's former name, so it was unclear who had written that phrase. Her mother suggested it might be a coincidence or perhaps from an admirer. At that time, Kirby had just started working and occasionally helped her mother's band. One day, she received a strange phone call filled with the sounds of musical instruments, followed by someone shouting in the background. Kirby asked if they could lower the volume, and suddenly her mother shouted the same question only a few seconds later. This situation was just like Julia's. Although Kirby found it odd at the time, she didn't dwell on it. Back in the present, she finally found the phrase, now covered by another canvas. She was now certain that the killer had been there. On the other side, Dan visited the families of past victims, but couldn't find any connection until he spoke with Summer's lawyer girlfriend. She mentioned that Summer had changed a lot before her death, becoming more silent, but she hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, thinking maybe Summer was seeing another girl secretly. Now she wondered if perhaps Summer had offended someone dangerous in the past, leading to the tragedy. While looking through Summer's belongings, Dan was stunned. He went through his files and discovered a shocking secret. An heirloom left by Summer's grandmother was found inside another victim, and Summer had no apparent connection to this person. This was the link they were looking for. As soon as Kirby returned to the newsroom, Dan hastily pulled her aside, leaving a visibly more upset Marcus. Dan shared his findings that the connection between the victims was that the killer left an item from the previous victim inside the next one. Considering the cases spanned over 20 years, it seemed the killer spent a lot of time observing his targets. The victims didn't know each other and had no commonalities, except for the items found within them. This revelation led Kirby to change her mind, and she suggested using her own experiences for the report, even if it meant directly revealing her information to the killer. With the Pavel case approaching trial, Dan and the chief editor decided to inform the police beforehand. Kirby decided to have a talk with Ginny, setting aside the fact that Ginny's keys could travel through time and that the murderer had taken her keys. It surely meant that Ginny was also being targeted. The killer had watched all this not far away and realized that Kirby was a survivor, so he started to follow her. After Kirby got to Ginny's place and explained the situation, Ginny was sure that she hadn't received any strange phone calls, nor had she been stalked. Kirby suggested that Ginny carry a knife for self-defense, just like she did, but Ginny thought Kirby was being overly paranoid and didn't agree, as she was in a hurry for her night shift. Before they parted, Ginny asked what the killer had left inside Kirby. Kirby told her it was a matchbox from a bar with no address, and they didn't know which victim it originally belonged to. Ginny then said that just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen, and some things need to be looked at repeatedly to be understood. She asked Kirby to contact her if she found anything concrete. She then left in the rain, buying a red umbrella from the convenience store across the street. This timeline is set just before Ginny goes to work with the red umbrella as shown in the beginning of this drama. Inspired by Ginny's words, Kirby went to the address on the matchbox, which led her to a laundry shop that was now closed, seemingly out of business. On a table, she found a pile of matchboxes from the Happy Bee bar. The killer appeared at that moment and approached Kirby like a stalker, asking what happened to her hair, why she had moved, and how she found Ginny since she couldn't possibly know her. It seemed that the effects of time-space transformation were also affecting the killer. When the killer got close, Kirby recognized him as the same man who had given her a pony 28 years ago. She was puzzled why he hadn't aged at all when he suddenly strangled her, murmuring that he had already killed her and she shouldn't be here. Kirby tried to fight back with her knife, but the killer overpowered her and pressed her against the washing machine. The walls full of washing machines turned black and white, then the wallpaper changed to orange. The killer seemed even more panicked and realized that his actions were creating a butterfly effect. As Kirby struggled, she saw the tattoo on the killer's chest, and at the same moment, she was thrown out by him. Now the wall turned to glass. Kirby didn't have time to think and ran out the door, but when she turned around after exiting, she saw the laundry shop shockingly turned into the Happy Bee bar. In this episode, the killer realizes that his actions can change the people and events on the timeline, and the interaction between Kirby and Ginny is also affecting the timeline. The future is no longer set in stone. Ginny might not necessarily die. The scene shifts to Kirby rushing to the police station to describe the assailant's appearance to a sketch artist. At the same time, the killer wakes up in the hospital in a state of terror, his screams attracting the attention of a fellow patient. The killer tries to bribe his wardmate to untie him, but his wallet has long been emptied. Enduring a splitting headache, he asks how long he's been out and learns he's been unconscious since the previous afternoon, which makes him even more anxious. He insists that the wardmate help him, warning that staying away from home too long will result in death, just like it did for his comrade Leo. The meaning behind these words becomes clear later on. Terrified, the wardmate quickly unties him, and the killer leaves in a desperate escape, enduring severe headaches as he makes his way back to a building, his so-called home. Once inside, his discomfort instantly eases, hinting that this house is key to his ability to travel through time. After the sketch is completed, Dan approaches a veteran officer, claiming that the man who attacked Kirby last night is the same one who has killed 7 people over 20 years. However, the old cop says the evidence is insufficient and intends to treat it as a simple assault. Dan notices the sketch on the table, recognizes the man as the one he saw outside Julia's house, and realizes he's been under surveillance. After work, Kirby plans to return to the bar for clues. While the sketch artist is distracted, she secretly takes the killer's sketch. Dan tries to persuade her to take a break and at least call home to check in, but Kirby is resolute, complaining about the police's inefficiency and saying she would rather investigate on her own. Dan has no choice but to accompany her to the bar, which is sealed off at both the front and back entrances. Dan reveals his encounter with the killer, suspecting that he might have inadvertently led the killer to them. But Kirby doesn't think so because she's sure she saw the killer 28 years ago, but can't understand why he hasn't aged a day. Dan is incredulous and suspects Kirby might be mentally unstable, but she is adamant she's correct. She vividly remembers her surroundings are always changing. After the attack, she had been reporting to work regularly for a whole year, yet one day she's told by security that she hasn't been to work for months, and her colleagues have no recollection of her. Back home, Kirby was stunned to find her mother had become her roommate. She was certain she had been living alone since growing up, and only she remembers the changes in her life. People around her had no impression of any change. As for her so-called husband, Marcus, she had no idea how he came into her life or how she could possibly get rid of him. The information was overwhelming, and Dan struggled to accept it. To prove her point, Kirby pulled out a Happy Bee matchbox, reasoning why the killer could have it 6 years ago when the bar only appeared last night. Before that, it was clearly a laundry shop. But Dan was confused, saying they were here just a week ago, and it was already a bar then. It seems that only those directly affected remember the changes in time and space. Seeing that Dan didn't believe her, Kirby felt helpless and forced herself to calm down. Inside the planetarium, Ginny was reviewing the case reports and recalling her conversation with Kirby from the previous night, which finally made her wary. She asked a colleague to check the key usage records and discovered someone had used a key to enter and exit on the same day as her. She now believed that Kirby's warnings were not unfounded and someone was indeed tracking her. Back at the newspaper office, everyone was busy with tips from concerned citizens, but there were no valuable leads. In the meeting room, faced with a mountain of clues, Kirby interrupted Dan's speech and suggested reporting her own assault from the previous night. She even produced the sketch she had taken. Dan stopped her, explaining that the police wouldn't want the suspect's sketch published, as it would overwhelm them with more work than they could handle, making it impossible to spare anyone to make an arrest. The chief editor agreed that they couldn't afford to clash with the police, or they would be at a disadvantage. With no other option, Kirby returned to the archives only to run into Ginny, who had come looking for her. Faced with the sketch, Ginny was uncertain. She led 12 tour groups every day at the planetarium and couldn't be sure if the face was among them. Kirby asked Ginny if she had noticed any changes after losing her keys. Ginny thought about it and felt everything was normal. She hadn't experienced the changes Kirby had. It seemed that only the killer and Kirby were aware of the changes from the time travel around them, and Kirby was desperate to understand why. Ginny cited 2 examples, suggesting they might be related, connected by an invisible thread, unable to act independently. If one was affected, the other would react accordingly. In short, Kirby and the killer were influencing each other. The perplexed included the killer himself. He visited the sanatorium to find Leo, speaking of how everything outside his home had undergone changes. As they conversed, Leo paced the hallway, hitting the doorbell at each end. Leo began to suspect that perhaps the killer was starting to lose his sanity, but the killer believed that these changes were brought about by Kirby, whom he thought was not discovering this for the first time. On the other hand, Leo considered that Kirby knew something that the killer was unaware of, a point the killer disagreed on. After pressing the doorbell for the 19th time at the hallway's end, and despite Leo's reluctance, he turned and left. The scene shifts, and the killer is back to the night when Kirby found Ginny. This time, he eavesdropped from a side door, intentionally leaving it ajar. The wind and rain created a loud noise against the door, which Ginny dismissed, thinking it was just not properly closed, and prepared to leave for her night shift. Kirby, following the noise, approached the side door just as Ginny closed it, commenting on the door's poor quality. Unbeknownst to her, the killer was watching them from outside. Due to the brightness inside, Kirby could only see her reflection in the door. Suddenly, Kirby's hair changed from long to short, a transformation clearly seen by the killer, who smiled as if he had grasped a clue. He confirmed that if the past changes, so does the future. Back to the present, Kirby's hair is now short. After learning that Kirby and another person had visited the archive, the police called to inquire because the seal on the evidence box from Kirby's assault case was broken. The chief editor hung up the phone and then asked Kirby if she had taken anything from it. Kirby claimed she hadn't, but we know she had taken the matchbox from the archive. Dan, although speaking in Kirby's defense, wasn't by her side the whole time and thus was unaware. But now, even Dan began to doubt whether the matchbox was indeed real evidence. Kirby, deeply troubled, found a place to alleviate her stress. Marcus came to comfort her using his muscles and brought her back to this unfamiliar home. After dinner, Marcus showed Kirby his military photos from his service years. As they turned the pages, Kirby noticed a tattoo on one of the soldiers that was identical to the killer's, a trendy design at the time, suggesting that the killer had once been a soldier. A nervous Dan sought out Kirby's mother, initially to ask about the strained relationship between her and her daughter, but the mother refused to divulge anything. She believed Dan brought too much danger to Kirby and didn't want to be a victim in Dan's reports. Dan pressed on, asking if her daughter had ever had any mental health issues, to which the mother agitatedly responded that her daughter was neither crazy nor a liar. It was only then that Dan realized he had made a mistake. As dawn broke, the timeline switched back to the first episode when Ginny was just starting her work shift. Ginny entered the planetarium, holding a red umbrella. But unlike that in the past, this time she looked back before entering to check if anyone was following her. What followed was the usual clocking in, though with much hesitation. Kirby placed the umbrella on the rack and entered the office, also noticing a bee with a broken wing on the table. Meanwhile, Dan arrived at the sanatorium where the victim Julia used to work and encountered Kirby, who was there conducting her investigation. He suggested they examine the files related to Julia's case together and mentioned that her clients were mainly on the second floor. The duty officer on that floor recognized Kirby and the portrait of the killer she had brought with her. The officer mentioned that the person in the portrait often came to the sanatorium, not to see Julia, but to chat with someone named Leo. The floor where Leo resided was mostly inhabited by people with severe dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The only thing the sanatorium could do was to arrange the patients' rooms with personal items to help strengthen their memories. However, according to brain imaging, Leo's memory issues seemed more psychological in nature. Dan attempted to coax information out of the patient Leo, but the officer remained silent. With no other immediate options, Dan decided to go downstairs and start with the register, leaving Kirby to continue the conversation. Kirby wanted to find out the killer's real name and address, but Leo appeared to be terrified of her. He pleaded with Kirby not to let the killer know she had been there, warning her of serious consequences. Kirby, taking advantage of his confused state of memory, lied that Leo had already told her the killer's address and claimed she had come to retrieve something for him. Believing her, Leo revealed that he was no longer allowed to return to that home by the killer and accidentally disclosed that he had taken something from the killer. Kirby continued the ruse, pretending she was commissioned by the killer to retrieve it. Initially not fooled, Leo was swayed when Kirby threatened to tell the killer he had taken his property. Panicked, Leo retrieved a videotape from the toilet tank and begged Kirby to keep it a secret, imploring her not to tell the killer. Subsequently, Kirby and Dan watched the tape, which showed the killer filming a dancing woman who seemed to recognize him and Leo. It was clear that finding this woman was crucial to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, at the planetarium, Ginny went up to the rooftop to smoke just as before. However, this time the killer appeared right after the door closed. He had a message for Kirby. Seeing Ginny terrified and begging for her shitty life, he smiled reassuringly and told her it wasn't going to be today. Then he left, leaving Ginny in shock. Although the killer had placed the red umbrella on the parapet wall, the timeline had already shifted due to his actions, causing a change in the sequence of events. At the same time, Dan and Kirby were ready to leave the sanatorium when Kirby noticed that the color of Dan's car had changed. It was a brown Celica when they arrived, but now it had changed. Dan chose to trust her this time because he did indeed have a brown Celica before, which he had sold years ago. He was surprised that Kirby knew about his old car, so he asked her what his car looked like. Kirby answered that the passenger side seatbelt is broken and the person who used to sit there smoked because there are burn marks by the window. These details were only known to Dan. He now believed that changes were indeed happening around Kirby, and she was aware of them. These changes might represent things that would happen in the future. For example, Kirby's long hair turning short might mean that she would have long hair again in the future. The scene shifts to a standalone story, which mainly recounts the killer's past and the secrets of time travel. The killer's real name is Harper. On the battlefield in France, 1918, Harper was just an ordinary soldier when the enemy, seeing they were losing, launched mustard gas bombs. Facing the oncoming gas, Harper ran for his life. He bumped into his comrade Leo, who told him not to panic and gave him a gas mask, promising to follow right behind. An explosion sent Harper flying like a Barbie toy, destroying his gas mask. Holding his breath, Harper frantically searched the bodies for another mask. The last wounded comrade he found didn't want to give up his mask, believing he could still be saved. Harper pressed on the man's wound and forcibly took the mask, putting it on and taking a few deep breaths. That's how Harper survived, revealing much about his character. Time moved on to France in 1920. One night, a girl named Clara performed a stunning dance, showing her exceptional talent. After her performance, she thanked the audience, where she saw Harper with a displeased expression. In the dressing room, Harper approached her, and their conversation revealed that they were childhood sweethearts from a town, but had lost contact after Harper joined the military. Clara had become a renowned dancer and learned French. She wasn't interested in the visit from her old friend and wanted to distance herself. Harper admitted he had no honors from the war and was lucky to return safely. Their statuses were worlds apart. When Harper mentioned letters he sent, Clara lied about not receiving them and changed the subject to her dance. But Harper was not interested and killed the conversation. He offered Clara a handkerchief, claiming it was specially brought from Paris. Only then did Clara take a serious look at Harper's handkerchief, which had a hole. Harper explained that it was accidentally damaged by his folding knife. Subsequently, they embarked on a rather unconventional date, peering through windows. It turns out Harper had been watching the owner, an old nun, for some time. He knew that every Wednesday she would prepare dinner in the basement for the veterans, and he had once been among their number. Once the nun had left, Harper led the way through the window, and Clara, unable to resist the temptation, followed him inside. As they rummaged for valuables, they chatted, and the topic soon turned to Harper. Clara pointed out that Harper always loved to spy and did so with great enthusiasm. She recalled how he once lay in a carriage, watching her like a little mouse. Harper defensively claimed he was protecting her. Clara hesitated, seemingly wanting to make it clear to Harper that they were not a good match, but was interrupted by a noise. While searching through a drawer, Harper found an electronic watch, which neither of them had ever seen before, because such watches wouldn't exist for another 30 years. Before they could ponder this, the sound of the nun's footsteps approached, and Clara left first in fear. Harper, boldly confronting the nun, demanded to know the origin of the watch. The old nun recognized Harper at a glance, noting he never prayed before meals. Harper seized her by the neck and pressed for answers. The nun retorted that he would never understand how insignificant he was. Harper shot back, confident that he knew who she was, pointing out her husband's photo on the wardrobe and the candle she lit for him nightly. He declared that he had been watching her and she couldn't lie to him. In the next scene, Harper was panting and searching for Clara in the alleyway. He lied that he hid under the bed to ensure the nun didn't discover Clara, as it could ruin her future prospects. Clara expressed concern that the nun might call the police. Harper quickly changed the subject, offering her the watch. Clara wanted to refuse, as it wasn't hers to take, but Harper boastfully declared that the old woman didn't deserve such a fine thing. He argued that the old nun has much more than either of them, and it's time they took back some divine justice. Clara was persuaded, and together they admired the romantic allure of the watch. Soon after, Harper sought out his comrade Leo, ready to investigate the mysterious house from the previous episodes where Harper had been staying. When Harper left the nun's house, he had taken her husband's photo, which had this address written on the back. Considering a veterans gathering happening on the main street, the two donned military uniforms to blend in. Leo pried open a side door, and they entered. Inside, Leo asked Harper where the house came from. Harper lied that it belonged to a distant relative. They scoured the house, with Leo grabbing any valuable items, and he urged Harper to check upstairs. Harper made his way up, eager to discover the origin of the watch. Leo found a box of banknotes he had never seen before. Harper discovered a 1973 yearbook on the desk. Just then, he thought he heard something. As it turned out, the homeowner, the nun's husband, was hiding in the wardrobe, pleading with them to take the money and leave quickly. But Harper wasn't one to give up so easily. The next second, the homeowner emerged with a gun, his question catching Harper off guard, asking him if it's in World War I or World War II. Harper, having only experienced World War I, was confused about how the man didn't know the time period. The homeowner continued to ask for the date, and upon hearing it was October 9th, he muttered to himself that he had not lived through that day, implying that it was a day he had not experienced, and if he had, he should have been well prepared. Harper just wanted to know the origin of the watch and falsely claimed to be a craftsman, wanting to know how the watch was made. The homeowner thought Harper only wanted the watch, so he casually handed one over to him. But Harper was not satisfied. He wanted to understand everything. Taking advantage of the second homeowner's distraction, Harper overpowered him with a punch. The homeowner said that one can only pass through the house here, as the house had its own rules. Suddenly, Leo burst in asking what he was doing and urged him to let the man go. Seizing the opportunity, the homeowner hurriedly fled, and after rushing onto the road, he was hit and killed by a car. The homeowner revealed that the house had its own rules, but what exactly those rules were would be revealed later. Harper, to his surprise, found that the things outside the house were obviously different than when they had arrived. Incredibly, but also realizing that they could travel through time and space via the house, Harper couldn't wait to bring Clara to visit this magical house. The two lay in the house watching the lights, which suddenly changed. Harper explained that things here randomly became new or old, but he still didn't know the principle behind it. Then he asked Clara to concentrate and think of an era for their destination. Clara said the farther from here, the better. Harper opened the back door, and they traveled to the modern world, the farthest day they could go. Harper explained that this was the limit. They couldn't go any further, or they'd end up back on October 9th, 1920. As for the principle, he didn't know either. It was one of the house's rules. He realized that not all eras were accessible for time travel, and each homeowner had different times they could traverse. Taking advantage of Clara's good mood, Harper took the opportunity to ask why she hadn't replied to his letter back in the day. Clara said she didn't know how to start writing. Harper then declared that whatever she wrote would be fine, as long as it was from her. After a shopping spree at the mall, they returned to the house where Leo was sulking inside. He too had tried the back door but failed to travel through time. This meant that only Harper could traverse the boundaries of time, and he was the only one who could take someone with him. Because the homeowner died due to Harper, Harper took his place as the new homeowner. Clara was in high spirits and went upstairs to try on clothes, oblivious to the oddities around her. Hearing that Clara would be staying there, Leo showed his displeasure. Harper laid it out plainly, reminding Leo that he wouldn't be able to go anywhere without him, to which Leo retorted that without him, Harper would have died on the battlefield. After changing clothes, Clara invited Leo to join her in time traveling. This time, they arrived in the 1980s at the dance hall where little Kirby performed, which also became the second home of little Kirby and her mother. The mother was singing her heart out on stage, while little Kirby was tending the bar. At this moment, Harper hadn't started following little Kirby. This was probably also the first time Harper had encountered her. Harper looked at Kirby differently, and Clara noticed that. She remarked on little Kirby's beautiful green earrings and struck up a conversation with her. Then she turned to Harper and teased that Harper likes Kirby, so she will help him keep her. Despite Harper's denial, Clara still pulled little Kirby to the dance floor. Watching the lively bar, Harper felt a mix of emotions. He had money now and could travel through time at will like a god, but it seemed like the world had abandoned him because the girl he liked didn't feel the same. After the song, Clara invited Harper to dance, but he declined. She wasn't offended and went to the restroom to touch up her makeup. On the way, she encountered Leo and inquired about the past that Leo and Harper had in Paris. Seeing they were alone, Leo lowered his voice and confessed that he had never been to Paris with Harper, and perhaps she didn't really know Harper at all. At that moment, Harper appeared and interrupted them, and Leo tactfully left. Harper then concealed a camera under his coat, planning to go back and record Clara's outstanding performance. And just like that, they left Leo behind in the 1980s. After returning to the house, the recording began. The footage that Kirby and Dan saw previously was recorded at this time by Harper for Clara. During the performance, because Clara kept speaking French, Harper stopped her. Clara took the opportunity to confront him, pointing out that Harper had never been to Paris. Harper had no choice but to admit it, and also revealed that the handkerchief was not purchased by him, but taken from a dead body. Knowing the truth, Clara wasn't angry. She only requested Harper not to lie anymore. Harper tried to take this chance to advance further, but was rejected. In the argument, Harper slipped up and revealed that he had traveled back to this day multiple times to meet Clara. But no matter how many times, the outcome was always the same, indicating Clara simply didn't like Harper and saw him only as her childhood friend. Hearing that Harper had already experienced this scene multiple times was spine-chilling. Clara finally got angry and berated Harper as a coward. Enraged, he threw her heavy body onto the bed, brutally beat her, and then murdered her, making Clara his first victim. Her time of death was around 1920. As for the handkerchief, Harper took it from the body of a fallen comrade, the same one from whom he stole a gas mask. Because the handkerchief was embroidered with a name, Harper cut the name off with a knife, an act witnessed by Leo. Leo also knew that it was Harper who had stolen the mask, so for a while, he blackmailed Harper with this information. The cross-shaped cuts found on the bodies symbolized Harper's God complex, believing he had the right to decide life or death. After that, Harper went to the dance hall the day before he murdered Clara. While Kirby was pouring drinks, he bet her on the origin of her earrings, offering to pay if he lost. After pretending for a while, he gave the correct answer, that the earrings were a gift from her ex-boyfriend. However, Kirby said he was wrong, claiming she bought them at a dollar store, as the pain from a past partner is incomprehensible to others. Kirby decided to leave without the earrings or the money, not noticing Harper's increasingly sinister gaze. Initially, Harper only used the house for his time travel to win Clara's affection, but his twisted mentality became evident along the way. After killing Clara, he transformed into a deranged serial killer, murdering 7 women over a 20-year timeline. Kirby, as the only survivor, lived on. The murder case of Julia led Kirby to stop hiding her identity and instead became dedicated to finding the murderer. The scene shifts to a memory of Kirby's. It was 6 years ago, the night of the attack incident. She was full of youthful vigor, practically striding with the wind. On that day, she received her very first exclusive report, a story on a judge caught taking bribes. She and her mother celebrated the achievement before her mother hurried off to work with her band. Kirby decided to take her dog for a walk by the lake. Along the way, she encountered a few passers-by. While playing a game of fetch with her dog, Kirby was attacked by Harper and severely injured. Enduring the agonizing pain, she managed to crawl away and call for help. The memory ends with the image of Kirby with a cloth stuffed in her mouth, which is as far as she recounts the experience to Ginny. What puzzles Kirby is that there were bystanders nearby at the time of the attack, but suddenly they all disappeared. She speculates that the assailant must have known it was a time when no one would be around. Ginny also shares the incident of the assailant looking for her on the rooftop. They piece together that this happened at the same moment Dan's car changed color, lending credence to Dan's theory that these events are set to happen in the future. They're just happening earlier than expected. In other words, Ginny will be targeted by the killer in the future. It's just not her time yet. To avoid sitting ducks, they decide to take proactive measures. Back at home, Kirby and Dan rewatch the video and pick up on a keyword. Surmising it may be an address, they decide to go back to the press to look for clues. Dan suggests to Kirby that she should call her husband Marcus to check in, considering she hadn't returned all night. Meanwhile, Ginny returns to work at the planetarium as usual. She inquires with the security guard about any strangers coming in and out. Her colleague assumes Ginny is just nervous about the upcoming opening ceremony on the 27th, where she will present her years of research findings. Ginny mentions the encounter with the stranger on the rooftop, but then quickly changes the subject. Her colleague doesn't press further, instead inviting her to lunch, which she readily accepts. This inadvertently foils the killer's plan to approach her in the projection room, leaving him infuriated. While rummaging for information on the keyword, Kirby ran into Marcus, who just happened to be passing by. She greeted him and shared the progress they had made, not expecting anything remarkable. Surprisingly, Marcus revealed that the keyword she was working on is a local meat packaging factory nearby, a place he and Dan had once reported on. Kirby was stunned because Dan had no memory of it. Marcus suggested that it might not be wise for his wife to rely on Dan for the investigation and offered to accompany her instead. But Kirby insisted on going with Dan, maintaining that to them, Marcus was a complete stranger based on the photos Marcus had shown her. She hadn't seen or been to the places in those photos, implying these experiences were not yet part of her life. However, Marcus wondered if the incident from 6 years ago had damaged Kirby's brain, and now Dan was leading her astray. Kirby, however, had no time to explain further as she needed to rush to the meat factory. Perhaps she could still save a victim. At the factory, Kirby noticed the butcher's precise method of dissecting pigs, which was identical to the killer's technique. This led them to deduce that the killer might have been a butcher. To confirm this, they spoke with the factory owner's brother, asking if there had been an employee named Clara, rumored to be a dancer. The man recalled that Clara was indeed murdered here. He took them to a basement that had been out of use for a decade, where the body was found in a vat used for bleeding pigs. The corpse was covered with radium powder, likely for stage effects, which Clara must have applied herself, indicating that the radium originated from her. Dan inquired whether anyone could have returned to dump a body after the place was closed. The man denied this, explaining that the body was found while the facility was still operational. It was shut down in 1982, but the body was discovered in 1920. This revelation shocked them. Still not knowing that it involves time travel, Dan suspected that this Clara was not the one from the videotape, but Kirby firmly believed it was the same person. The killer had thrown her into the vat, mixing her with pig's blood and feces as a form of punishment, just like the day Kirby was attacked, surrounded only by sand and trash. At the planetarium, another mishap occurred. While Ginny was adjusting the equipment in the projection hall, she had barely spoken a few words when the microphone malfunctioned. She tried to get her colleague from the projection room to help, but the shadowy figure standing there didn't respond to her. Before she could react, a recording started playing. It's the very recording when the killer murdered her. Terrified, Ginny rushed out of the projection hall and ran smack into her colleague, who had just returned from the restroom and found himself locked out of the projection room. At that very moment, time and space seemed to shift. The once empty warehouse instantly turned into a cold storage room hung with dead pigs. Realizing the killer must be after Ginny, Kirby frantically called to ensure her safety. After confirming she was unharmed, Kirby wanted her to go home, but Ginny insisted on staying due to the importance of the evening's event. With no other choice, Kirby continued to search for clues with Dan. They found Clara's union card from back in the day, which listed her occupation as a meat trimmer, with her start date being May 24, 1917. Kirby also found the union card of the killer, a certain John Smith. Meanwhile, Marcus took Kirby's diary to the chief editor, venting his frustrations. He thought Kirby was too deep in the case, affecting her mental and intellectual state. As her husband, he felt obligated to protect his wife from harm. Oblivious to his concerns, Kirby and Dan were sitting on the steps, piecing together the clues they had found. The situation was beyond Dan's comprehension. He speculated that the killer might be John's son or even grandson. Kirby dismissed this, convinced they were the same person. Even with powerful genetics or mutations, it's impossible for two individuals to look exactly like clones. As for the report, they decided to simply release the photos first and hold back on the other details. Kirby thought that, given Dan's relationship with the chief editor, persuading her wouldn't be difficult. However, Dan grimly noted that things had changed. The editor had once valued him, assigning him to a special report, but he ended up getting arrested for drug use, and after being bailed out by the editor, the report was inevitably scrapped. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation was overheard clearly by the killer lurking in the shadows. Not long after they returned to the newspaper office, the chief editor ordered Kirby to take a leave of absence, claiming it was to reassess her position, a prelude to dismissal. The case coverage would continue, just without Kirby. She didn't bother to argue and walked away, leaving Dan to contend with the editor. He handed the union cards to the editor, suggesting they be published, but the editor found the notion absurd. A person from the 1920s couldn't possibly be the serial killer. As Dan became more impassioned, the editor suggested he too should take time off to be with his child. Kirby returned to her desk and found that Marcus had already packed up all her belongings. One look at his expression and she understood everything. She told Marcus that even if she was fired, she would continue the investigation at all costs. Marcus realized this was the signal for separation. The couple parted on unhappy terms. Back at home, Kirby's mother came to help pack. Without a second glance, she threw things into the suitcase, indignant that her daughter had been fired. Kirby's mother tried to comfort her daughter by mentioning her past report made on the corrupt judge. Before she could finish, Kirby remembered the night she received that report, the same night she was attacked. It dawned on her that the killer chose to strike at moments that were meant to be their crowning glory, their brightest moments. This was why the series was called Shining Girls, because all the victims were shining girls. Kirby immediately grabbed the little pony and headed for the planetarium. Tonight's event was also a moment of glory for Ginny. Meanwhile, at the newspaper, Dan received the evidence report originally meant for Kirby about Clara. Together with his son, they discovered a receipt dated April 15, 1981, with an address at Clifton Street. But how could Clara, who was murdered in the 1920s, have a receipt from 61 years later? With questions in mind, the father and son duo rushed to that address. The event at the planetarium was happening as planned. A colleague rushed to tell Ginny there was a problem with the equipment. Hurrying to the scene, Ginny was about to start adjusting the equipment when she heard footsteps and quickly hid. Fortunately, it was Kirby who arrived. They didn't realize the killer had deviated from his usual pattern this time. After leaving his son in the car, Dan walked alone into the dance hall at Clifton Street, the very place where Clara had performed years ago and where Kirby and her mother had performed later. Dan found a message the killer had left for Kirby on one wall and then discovered a poster from Clara's performance on another. Suddenly, the killer appeared behind him, inflicted a severe wound with a knife, and Dan managed to grab something from the killer before collapsing motionless. The killer then nonchalantly left in Dan's coat, looking victorious. On his way out, he was stopped by Dan's son, who asked if he had seen his father. The killer denied it, but when questioned about why he was wearing his dad's coat, the killer didn't reply and instead, with a meaningful smile, told the boy to take care of himself. Leaving a bloodied fingerprint on the car window, he walked away. As Dan was being attacked, the fabric of time shifted once again. Ginny, hurrying back to the planetarium to retrieve some documents, was stopped by a security guard who strangely claimed not to recognize her. To her shock, the event poster beside her now featured her colleague as the speaker instead of herself. Even her clothes had changed, and she now had a backpack. The colleague and another guard who arrived subsequently also had no recollection of Ginny, treating her as a stranger and ushering her out. Stepping outside, Ginny noticed that even Kirby's attire and hairstyle had changed. This is because the killer did not go after Ginny but targeted Dan. So after surviving, Ginny's timeline had also altered, and like Kirby, she was aware of these changes. The scene shifts back to Chicago's Lakeview area in 1848, where the homeowner, then a common worker, stumbled upon a house that could traverse time while collecting specimens. Venturing inside, he encountered a host of unfamiliar modern items and a person who had apparently hanged himself at the stairwell, dressed in contemporary clothes. A note with "All yours" was pressed under the body. Shortly after, the homeowner left, dragging a sack that likely contained the hanged individual, presumed to be the first known owner of the house. In the next scene, Harper returns to the house and finds a dog. It's Kirby's Grendel. Harper opens the back door and dismisses the dog with a stick. Back to the bewildered Kirby and Ginny. They're perplexed as to why the killer didn't strike that night. Ginny feels helpless, having inexplicably lost her job, unsure of her next steps. But Kirby remains calm and opens her wallet to reveal Ginny's current address, which is her graduate school residence, and her workplace has changed to the accelerator lab, with her profession now listed as a mechanical technician. Kirby urges Ginny to return to this address and play along with the roles to avoid alarming colleagues and family who would otherwise think she's insane if she shared her experiences. Kirby reassures her before heading to Dan's house, only to be met by an elderly man claiming to have lived there for years. She rushes to the newspaper office, but it's deserted. Attempting to call her mother, a stranger answers. At a loss, Kirby decides to rest on the floor for the night and figure out her next steps in the morning. Kirby was roused by a colleague the next morning, and looking around, the office seemed normal, as if Kirby's dismissal had never happened. In fact, Kirby was genuinely a reporter with her own workstation. The colleague's words, however, shocked her. It turns out the police now wanted to close the case quickly, so they offered a large sum for the prime suspect Pavel to confess his murder of Julia. As for other victims, there was no mention. Only one person was known to have been killed. The real shock came when the editor mentioned that Dan had been murdered in a bar the previous night. Despite his long resignation, Kirby had brought him into the fold initially. This meant that all the efforts Kirby and Dan had exerted together had been in vain. Distraught, Kirby stepped out of the meeting room, crouching down to catch her breath, until Ginny arrived just in time to comfort her. Meanwhile, the killer Harper found his comrade Leo in the sanatorium, bluntly asking if anyone had come asking about Clara, or if it was him who stole the videotape. Leo responded that he couldn't remember, and even if he had taken the tape, he had no idea where it might be now. Frustrated to the point of madness, Harper forced himself to stay calm and pressed Leo to think harder. Leo suggested he could recall better back at the mysterious house, but Harper didn't agree. Then Leo had an episode asking Harper when he had arrived, which left Harper dumbfounded. It seems that Leo's mental illness stemmed from being left in the future 80s, when Harper and Clara returned through time as shown previously. Therefore, not returning to the house in time could result in mental illness, revealing another rule of the house. Dan's death was a heavy blow to Kirby. Ginny said she had returned to her own residence the previous night, but seemed to be a dropout bad student. The dropout date was May 15, 1986, the day Kirby was attacked. It appeared that nothing had changed before that day, but afterward, everything had. This was similar to the example given to Kirby about two particles connected by an invisible thread. Now, that thread connected them to the killer. To sever this tie, it seemed they had to remove one particle, setting everyone free. With no other options left, Kirby was willing to take the risk. On the other hand, Harper, having no other choice, took Leo back to the magic house. As soon as they entered, Leo miraculously recovered, mumbling about wanting to go home to watch a soccer match. Regarding the videotape, he knew only that he wouldn't hand it over to anyone else, but as to its whereabouts, he couldn't remember. Harper naturally couldn't let him go. During their argument, Leo threatened him by bringing up the past, how they had abandoned Clara's body together, and suggesting that Harper was afraid the contents of the tape would be discovered, exposing his crimes. He challenged if Harper wanted to know where it was, then take him back to the day they found it. Harper refused, and Leo taunted him further, saying that he had tried this trick on Clara before, and it didn't end well. It would be the same for him. What's more, Harper didn't want to go back to that day because he couldn't face reality. No matter when or where, he was always useless, and nobody else wanted him. Pushed to the edge, Harper stabbed Leo to death in a rage, and still not satisfied, he traveled through time randomly and killed a janitor and a woman camping by a lake. Back at the newspaper, Kirby found that her surroundings had changed again. All her colleagues were strangers. Without delay, she urged Ginny to contact the Legion Club from her desk. Since the killer had served there must be a clue. Kirby went straight to Marcus to inquire about those who had served in the 28th Legion, especially focusing on records of local veterans who had been involved in the Vietnam War. Marcus was willing to help, but it would take several days and Kirby couldn't wait. However, she forced herself to stay calm and asked about Marcus's wife, relieved to hear she was doing well. It turns out Marcus's wife wasn't her in this new timeline. Kirby then noticed a photo of Dan hanging on the wall and inquired about it, learning it was a colleague who was responsible for reporting Dan's story. That colleague revealed the truth about Dan's death. He was killed in self-defense during an attempted knife-point robbery, and the stolen goods were found on his body. How had it come to be that Dan was the bad guy? Suddenly, someone approached Ginny, asking why she was rifling through their desk. Ginny was confused, but realized that another shift had occurred. As they spoke, several security guards came to take her away. Kirby, returning from her colleague's desk, heard from Marcus about Ginny being mistaken for a stranger and taken away by security. The next second, Marcus looked at her surprisingly and asked who she was. It seemed that time and space had changed multiple times in a very short period, as if the killer was acting recklessly like a naughty child. Without a moment to explain, Kirby headed straight for the morgue, only to find that the old coroner had changed back to the original lady coroner. She requested to see Dan's body and mentioned the shape of the fatal wound. The lady coroner was taken aback, asking her how she could know that. Kirby replied that because that's the style of the killer. She knew Dan well enough to be certain he wouldn't steal without good reason. Whatever he had taken must have belonged to the killer. After some persuasion, the lady coroner agreed to a coffee break while she cautioned Kirby against touching anything haphazardly. Kirby understood, and following the hint, she found the evidence and retrieved the item Dan had stolen. It was the photo of the homeowner that Harper had taken from the old nun's house. Before leaving, she glanced at Dan's body and vowed to avenge him. But emerging from the morgue, Kirby saw that the lady coroner had transformed into the old coroner. Using the address, she found the house and broke in through a window. Inside, she found a collection of toy ponies on the cabinet and placed the killer's pony from her pocket among them. It seemed she had discovered the killer's hideout, littered with his collected trophies, including her own green earrings, lost years ago in a bet. As she opened the window, she realized everything. When Harper returned home, he was startled by the sound of the television, which was playing a video of Clara dancing. Taking advantage of his distraction, Kirby ambushed him, but he quickly overpowered her using his muscles. However, Kirby managed to grab a shard of glass and stabbed it into Harper's neck. The scene shifts to the year 1920, the day Harper met Clara. Everything was as usual, with Harper shyly trying to please her, but this time Clara was exceptionally cold and exposed all his lies, even predicting what Harper was about to say. It seems that something odd has happened on Clara. That night, Harper had no choice but to slink off to the old nun's house to commit theft alone. This time, the electronic watch was deliberately placed under the bed, with a photo of Harper in the act of stealing beside it, the address of the house written on the back. Following the familiar sequence, Harper and Leo, in military uniform, headed to the house. Shortly after entering through the back door, Kirby shot Harper from behind and chased Leo away. Obviously, Kirby had found the way to travel to an earlier time to intervene in the killer's timeline. Terrified, Harper pleaded for mercy, but Kirby coldly told him that he is the second son of a German mother, unwanted by anyone after she died, not even by the nuns. That's why he feels the world owes him, that he can take whatever he wants from anyone, especially from those shining girls. Confused at the time, Harper confessed that he didn't know her, but Kirby said she knew him someday and she was always be with him. She declared this hour was hers now, threatening to kill him if he didn't get out of her house, and she had done it not for the first time. This indicates that Kirby had likely entered the house multiple times. She must have tried many times to find the best point to restore the timeline, finally choosing the year 1920 to reveal Harper's true nature to Clara. That explains why Clara gets to know Harper was lying to her and could predict what he's about to say. Not long after the injured Harper left, his military uniform vanished, and Leo looked at him as if he were insane. Harper was starting to lose it, saying that they met on the battlefield, but Leo retorted that Harper had never been a soldier, let alone been to war. He asked him what he had taken from that house. Harper pulled it out and saw it was the pony toy he had given to a young Kirby in the first episode, but these events would no longer happen. This indicates that Kirby had successfully cut off his future connection with her, causing a significant shift in his timeline. As things were resolved, the victims of those years one by one returned to the living world, enjoying happy lives with their families and loved ones. Julia did indeed make it to the seaside, and Ginny returned to the planetarium, where she shone brightly in her presentations. Kirby found Dan, resurrected in a bar. He was still a reporter. She bet him she could guess what was in his pocket, and of course, she guessed right. A bleary-eyed Dan felt he had seen her before, but couldn't quite remember. Kirby then wrote the address of the house in his notebook, saying if he ever wanted to see her, come to this address. At the story's end, she returned home and, with a thought, summoned the dog she had raised. Thus, Kirby took over from the killer and became the new owner of the house. According to the house's rules, she was now bound to it, a foreshadowing present previously that the old nun's husband never lived with her because he couldn't leave the magic house. With that, the drama comes to an end. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.